from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we are really delighted to have our friend Stephen Hunter with us this afternoon. He's going to be talking about the brand new book, The Gunman Jackson Swagger, which takes us back to 1890s Arizona territory. Um, and we are expecting signed copies. They should be along anytime. I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field if you'd like to order one of the few remaining ones we have left.
There are six,
There are
actually.
six. All right,
Six.
so don't delay. And I'm going to stay on the call tonight. But Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Patrick is staying on the call in part because my voice is treacherous, and I don't want Stephen to have to listen to me cough and carry on. I am so delighted to see Stephen. We've had so much fun here together over the years. He's the only author that ever had a shooting range in our parking lot, for which I had to get a special permit from the city. And Stephen, I asked them in relation to Jack's event on Sunday if it were possible for us to do that again. And they said no, that you were like the one-time approval for, for the whole thing. So I'm really glad we did that. Do you remember you brought a selection of guns and everybody got to?
I don't think I did. I think there was some guy there who'd contacted you, and he had a much better collection of sniper rifles than I do.
Weren't
Ah,
And
that
they a
might
couple
be.
of stuntmen? Like a
yeah,
couple
that might have been it. I don't
of stunt
recall.
guys?
I've my memory. I'm as old as the hills, and my memory is full of holes, and I have vague impressions of that. I'm not sure if it really happened or I just dreamed it. You're telling me it did happen.
No, it actually happened. I
Okay,
remember
all
it
right.
very well, and it was really fun. Anyway, I ran into at Jack's event. I ran into our former police officer, the security officer for our area, and he brought it up,
Huh.
which I thought was, oh, there I go. I thought was really fun. So, Patrick, say a few words about the Western.
Say a few words about the.
Sorry.
That's okay. No, lest anybody thinks we were shooting live ammo in our parking lot, we certainly were not doing that.
No, it was blanks.
There were blanks, and as I remember it, it was a couple of like Western actor stunt guys, and they were kind of showing us how to draw, and it was pretty cool. It was right in our parking lot out back. Um,
That is cool.
but I don't
Yes.
remember who Stephen was with another author at the time, and is lost to memory.
Right.
Well, I've done it with Jack Carr. I've done it there with Stephen Kuntz. Could it have been
Might have
Steve?
been Kuntz, yes.
Yeah, yeah. He's a very decent guy.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Gunman Jackson Swagger, if I can talk without coughing, is another chapter in the Swagger family history. So those of you who remember reading Targeted will know that Stephen gave us some information about the arrival of the Swaggers in America. So you want to refresh everybody's memory? Surely you can remember that. You wrote it.
Well, I mean, if you had told me all those years ago I was going to end up writing a family saga about a bunch of alpha males from West Arkansas, I would have scoffed and laughed and acted superior. But basically, that's what I've spent my life doing, and I've sketched in various episodes from the past, and I'm surprised how much fun that is. And in this case, instead of just sketching in an episode, I dramatized the whole episode, and that was Jackson Swagger on a mission in 1897 in drought-parched southern Arizona. And basically, the research for the book I did when I went with you, Barbara, to a trip at some old people's home in the desert. And I don't remember the old people, I don't remember the home, but the desert was indelible to my imagination. It is such an incredible combination or melange of beauty and terror. I mean, everything was sharp and deadly and yet beautiful. And it was dry and rocky, and the sun was blazing, and the sky was infinitely beautifully blue, and the whole place just had this incredibly primal feel to it. And that went into my subconscious and it never really left. And when I came to write the book, I drew on that. And in fact, remember Barrett Tillman? Well, he lives in Mesa, Arizona. He read an early draft and he said, "How did you know so much about the Arizona desert?" And I had to thank Barbara Peters for dragging me out by my ear to speak to these old folks. And I don't think they had any idea who I was. I had no idea. The only thing that we all had in common was we knew you. And yeah, it was fine. It was great. But the trip out and the trip back were the real highlights of the adventure.
That's wonderful. We must have gone to Sun City West. They have a terrific library out there.
And that might be it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, yes, I think you do a good job. But coming back to Gunman Jackson Swagger, Stephen is a Pulitzer Prize winning film critic, among all his other works, which now take up, I'll show you, from his publisher, pages worth of Stephen Hunter books here. And he won the Pulitzer for us now playing at the Valencia, which I've always loved because the Valencia Theater in Evanston, Illinois, was one of the two theaters that I used to go to as
Yes,
a child.
everybody
As
it was
opposed,
Everton. Yeah.
yeah, as opposed to the varsity. They were like Evanston split in two, and the varsity was for the white folks in the suburbs, and the Valencia was for the black folks that came up from either Chicago or worked in Evanston. But anyway, it's a name emblazoned in my mind. And so Stephen has dedicated this book for the old guys. Now, who are the old guys? All right. John Wayne, John Ford, Jimmy Stewart, Gary Cooper, Sam Peckinpah, William Holden, John Wayne, Lyle and Tetra Gorch, Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood, Richard Boone, James Arness, Jack Mahoney, and John Wayne. So John Wayne, clearly, I mean, he's appears 3 times in this book. Why is that?
Well, I am a child of the 50s, not the 60s. I was born in 46, means I was 4 in 1950 and 14 in 1960. And those 10 years, as you know, are the years when the stuff, the information, the data, the culture, the traditions, it just pours into your brain and sinks down into the deepest level. And I was a movie kid and I was a Westerns kid. And that was the high watermark of the American Western. There were 7 Westerns on every night. I don't say I saw all of them. I saw most of them. And every week there was a new Western at the Valencia. Sometimes it was top billed, sometimes it was second billed, but I saw it all the last. And so I basically spent my childhood in the pop culture of the West, not the historic West, not the real West, but the West of movie and TV tropes. And it just was beaten deep into my brain, never left me. I still can remember gunfights and lines and scenes from those days. I remember Taza, son of Cochise, starring Rock Hudson. And I remember all sorts of obscure movies. They came to Kindura. I remember that. It's just amazing what I remember from those days. And so that's really sort of a fundamental part of the way my mind works. And I think, of course, John Wayne was the king back then. And there's every 3 weeks, it seemed, the Duke would appear in a new Western. And although it was a new Western, he was always the same. He was big, he was tough, he was mean, but he was skilled. He could ride a horse, but he was fundamentally very decent and believed in law and order. I don't think he ever played a bad guy. And so that sort of him and Hemingway, and I'm trying to think of who the third would have been, but they were sort of the trinity of my hero worship in those days. And so I would never just John Wayne is always in my head, and I tried to, I have a John Wayne-like character at at the older John Wayne at the center of this book, very John Wayne-esque, I hope, although a little bit of Clint Eastwood mixed in. But the book is informed by movies. Don't go to it expecting a archaeological reconstruction of the Old West. It's the Old West as seen through the prism of popular culture and a movie-oriented guy's appropriation of the imagery, the codes, the horsemanship, the dust, everything that was the Western in the 50s. I tried to at least allude to, if not represent completely. But again, I want to pat myself on the back because this
Was
is
this
really
John
cool.
Ford's
This is
West?
really cool. John Ford, of course, he might have been the third one, as a matter of fact, because he made some great westerns with and without John Wayne, and he was a brilliant American director. Um, but what I tried to do with this book was to use the tropes, but show them in a new light and give them a new meaning. What I was aiming for was something that was familiar and yet fresh. I mean, those seem like opposing poles of a literary enterprise, but it was my ambition to make it all familiar and yet make it all new. That was the point of the exercise. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. We'll find out in a few days.
Well, I found it interesting because I'm even older than you are by 6 years, and I am a child of the TV Western as well as the movie
Oh,
Western.
yes, indeed, of
So
course.
Hopalong Cassidy was the first thing I remember. My little sister, who's 2.5 years younger, when we got our television set, she was absolutely terrified of Hopalong Cassidy and all the gunfire and everything. So she
Yeah,
would
yeah, yeah.
go and she would sit on the stairs around the corner from the living room. There was a wall there with the TV there. And at the end, when, because they did a repeat, they showed it one day and then they showed it again the
Of
next
course.
day at different hours. So once she was sure that everybody, or at least Hopalong survived, she would then come and sit in front of it for the second showing. But we went on with Gunsmoke and Route 66 and what was the one set in Nevada that had that wonderful cast? It was like a father and two sons and
Oh, that was Bonanza. Is that what you're thinking?
yeah, Bonanza.
Yeah, that
Thank
was a
you.
very good show. Yeah,
I love Bonanza.
yeah.
And,
You
Little
left
Joe
out.
was like, remember, he was a real hero, Little Joe.
Yes, indeed. Now, do you
So, I
remember
mean, it wasn't just and what was James Garner's big TV, Maverick, right?
the Maverick? Yes, he
Yeah.
was fabulous in that.
It was. Stephen Cannell used to come and do book events with us when
Hmm.
he started writing novels, and Maverick was, a Stephen Cannell
Oh,
creator.
really?
Oh,
Yeah.
Gunsmoke too, of course.
Yeah, right. So we used to talk about that. I think he was a better director than a novelist, but
Yes,
he
probably
was,
so.
but you know what? He was a lovely man who had dyslexia. And I really admired him for wanting to write books and trying to deal with dyslexia, which was less of a problem,
Mhm.
for him making movies. But anyway, there were those guys were real heroes. I mean, I remember Little Joe from Bonanza, and everybody knew who they were. There were what, like three channels, so
Yes, that's
everybody
right.
watched the same television,
Yeah,
and there was a community of fans that would be hard to get today when everything's so splintered.
yeah, that's true. That's very true. Now, let me just mention my favorite TV cowboy, and that was Richard Boone in Have Gun Will Travel. A great
Yes.
show, and he is a very fine actor, and that was cool as hell. That was a great show.
Yeah, no, they really were, and you're right. They do. The things that you see when you're young stay in your mind, just like the music. I mean, the music that you hear as a teenager remains like a like
Yes,
an
it does.
earworm. I can
Yeah,
still, Patrick will not believe me. I can still do Chubby Checkers on Blueberry Hill,
yeah,
because it was a
yeah.
big thing. And I remember Elvis first time on television, and we used to listen to the Elvis records. And, I
Yep.
was in college when the Beatles came.
Uh,
I know. Right. Anyway, so everything old is new, and everything new is old in a way. What I thought you did in this book um, was that you took the glamour off, and you really showed it's dark, and the life. I was trying to imagine these people always in the same clothes, never getting a bath, subsisting on beans and coffee and an occasional piece of bacon, and working incredibly hard. And I'm amazed.
well, it was a tough life. And of course, as we romanticize it, it's a lot more glamorous than it was. And the gunfights, which were frequent, were short and bloody, and they were far from formal. They were like today's gunfights. They were spontaneous and cruel, and they were over in a split second. And usually, the person who fired first won. And it's one of our great fantasies is that two men faced each other in the street and drew on a signal. And I don't think that ever happened once in the West. But it's nevertheless, it's a great image. I mean, it says everything about the Western we want to say. We want it to say. It talks about honor and men facing each other and doing what they have to do. And I had uh, doing those things was great fun for me, and I must have seen 10,000 of them growing up, and you probably saw 12,000, but it was great fun getting those into the book.
I couldn't help but think of High Noon,
Oh
because
yes,
I
indeed.
think almost the only one in which, it was almost like an old, British aristocracy dueling thing where,
Yes.
the two guys. And interestingly enough, I had a childhood friend whose parents vacationed in, I don't remember, Mexico or the Caribbean or something, and got to be friends with Cady Hirano. And so she came to visit them for the premiere of High Noon. And I remember Carol and I sneaking up. Her parents had a living room that had a balcony. It was sort of like a castle. And there was Cady Hirano, kind of glamorously splayed out on the couch and, talking about the movie and everything. So we got to see it, even though we were kind of too young. Generally, there was sort of a code about not letting kids see a lot of things like that.
Well,
But
especially her role in that uh, it was difficult to explain the relationship between her and Gary Cooper. It was difficult to explain it to Grace Kelly, much less a bunch of 5-year-old girls in the suburbs of Chicago. So good luck with that.
Well, we were a little older, but nonetheless,
Okay.
there we were. Great. So, Patrick, I'm going to keep muting myself so I won't be coughing. Take a little break so you can talk to Stephen about movies and the Westerns because I know how much you love them.
Sure. Yeah. Um, you know, are you familiar with that Geronimo version with a 6 foot blue-eyed Chuck Connor playing
I've seen, well, there's a new station on so WPIX, and one of their four channels is all westerns, and it's not at all curated. And they'll put anything on. I mean, anything. Westerns from the 20s. And in fact, I did see flashes of that movie with Chuck Connors, the first
Yep.
baseman, as Geronimo. He was a far stretch from the real Geronimo, and a far stretch from the Wes Studi who played Geronimo
Right.
years later. Wes was, I think, probably more authentic. However, those 50s movies, we didn't expect them to be
Right.
realistic. I mean, that was sort of part of the fun was
Exactly.
how ridiculous they were. And the same thing, nobody ever bled. You got shot, and a little trickle of Hershey's chocolate ran out of the corner
Yeah.
of your mouth. And that was it for realism. But it was the drama, it was the characters, it was the landscape, it was the horses. It was also seeing variations on a theme. I mean, the movies were just packed with the same stuff every time, but because they did it, each director had to come up with something new. As I said before earlier, they tried to make it fresh, and they came. I this movie was on recently on WPIX. It's called Terror in a Texas Town with
Hmm.
Sterling Hayden, who's in a lot of the
Yeah.
westerns. And in the end is a gunfight or a fight between a guy with a gun and a New England whaler with a harpoon. So you tell me, if that doesn't, you know, seem ridiculous, nevertheless, they did it and they made it believable. And Sterling Hayden had the presence to bring it off. I don't remember who played the villain. Uh,
Hayden is such a fascinating character, isn't he?
oh, he is. Yeah, he's a
Yeah.
very interesting guy. And I think a much better actor than people give him credit for.
Wrote a
He's
couple books
good.
too that are
And
very good.
yes, and he made that connection early with Stanley Kubrick that
Mhm.
put him in some great films. And of course, he was in The Godfather. He was great in The Godfather.
The
Uh,
Killing, the Asphalt Jungle.
yes,
I
yes,
mean, he
yes,
was
yes,
just such a badass for the noir
yes,
genre.
yes. Yeah,
And
he's great in Asphalt Jungle.
do you know much about I mean this goes back a little bit earlier in the 50s, but the Tom Mix, you know?
No, Tom Mix was really more of the 30s and the
Yeah.
40s. Uh, and his westerns were, I don't know, I can only say more ornamental in the sense that the cowboys were overdressed, and he had a big 10-gallon hat and he wore two six guns in a very embroidered holster, or not embroidered, but heavily tooled Mexican
Right.
holsters. And he had the guns were silver with ivory grips, and he wore pants. He had a neckerchief around his neck, and he wore everything about it was kind of Art Deco, if you
Kind of
want to get at it,
the
and
dandy
and
West.
and sort of the reality of the frontier that became a thing more or less in the 40s and the 50s. But Tom Mix he preceded that, and he was a little too fancy for that.
But he was we're leaving out Roy Rogers and Gene Autry,
So we
who not
certainly are.
only were they important, but their horses were key to the whole thing
Yes, that's
too, you know.
exactly right. It is, and the horses were very important. Well, I think the horses, all three of those that we're talking about here, they were pitched more towards the younger audience. They were more for, boys under 12, which was a huge movie audience then as now. And they were sort of, there was no psychology. There was certainly no psychotic. There was no murder. Everything was, one of the countless strokes was shooting the gun out of the other guy's hand. Uh,
Mhm.
I don't think there's any record in the West of that actually happening, but it happened 38 times a week in the 1950s on television, and particularly in the early 50s, there were Autry had three series. One was The Range Rider with Jock Mahoney. Then there was his own series with Pat. Was I, and I thought there was, I can't remember the third one, but they were bloodless and well, and they always had fist fights, and they had a lot of shooting the guns out of people's hands, but there was very little actual death, whereas of course the real frontier was quite a bloody and violent place.
So Roy Rogers actually had a female, Dale Evans. I mean, they were kind of a pair, his wife, so that
Yes,
brought
they
a
were.
woman
That's
into it. And then we're skipping over the Lone Ranger
Oh, the Lone
and his
Ranger. Yeah.
friendly Indian Tonto,
Yeah.
which was it's probably the only reason anybody ever says Kimosabe was, if they had watched the Lone Ranger. So, it really. I don't know. I mean, Patrick and I have talked over the years about the idea that, and we're not alone by any means, um, that Chandler Hammett and the sort of hard-boiled guys really started writing when the frontier ended. California was the end, and the Western hero, the kind we're talking about, sort of morphs into, you know, the private eye.
That's exactly
Allegiance
right.
only to the guy that hired him as opposed to like law enforcement or something.
Yes.
Very much, I think, out of that Western
The
tradition.
loner, the
Patrick, do you
loner.
think that's why those books were so popular in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s? Was because we were already watching it all on the Western?
I mean,
Yes.
Steve
Yeah.
would have a better answer than that, I mean, but I think a lot of the guys coming back from the war were interested in more adult entertainment and they wanted to see the real streets and stuff like that. Would you agree with that, Steve? That
Yes, I would agree with that. And I would also, well, yeah, I mean, I would say that realism, street realism, entered via film noir and it sort of took over that segment of the filmmaking business before it sort of leaked into the Westerns. And the Westerns were influenced by the film noir and they became, oh, grubbier and more, they ended up with something like The Wild Bunch, which is not a movie for children. It's a great movie, I think, but it's a movie that sort of looks at a a visibly a malicious, malevolent, demonic, if you will, West of alpha males without any moral compunction, willing to shoot and kill anyone in order to accomplish their goals and loyal only to themselves with no commitment or no interest in the larger society around them. And that was something that was, I don't think that movie could have existed without generation or a whole generation of dark and disturbing and amoral city set crime movies. In other words, there was a real connection and a real influence there, I believe.
yeah, I love, the some of the 70s, like Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia,
Yes, yeah,
with Warren Oates, some of
yeah,
them are very much rooted in that dark noir,
yeah,
that sort
yeah,
of realism, that whole school.
yeah.
So,
Peckinpah was
so
a very interesting director. He was, of course, as many of them were, alcoholic and demonic and probably pretty much untrustworthy. But he was a great artist and he was able to get away with all sorts of shenanigans and make some great movies. So,
And
that's what you get.
some of those haunted war veterans like Robert Ryan, and Lee Marvin and some of those guys. Uh,
And they were great. And of course, in that movie, the great one was William Holden, who was not, I mean, Lee Marvin was a combat Marine. William Holden is said to have always been guilty because he was not in combat. He was in some public relations outfit. John Wayne was too, but he didn't know how to worry.
yeah. Well, Jimmy Stewart actually fought in the
He
war.
was, yes, he was a
He was
very
an
brave
officer.
infantry.
Wasn't he in the Air
Yes.
Force?
Yes,
He
he was in
was.
the Army Air Forces. He
Right.
was a B-24 pilot,
Right.
Liberator pilot. And he went on one of the worst raids of the war, which was to bomb the oil fields over Pulitzer. And he was very shaken by his war experiences. And I think it brought a maturity to his work that had not been there before.
Yeah, I can see your point. Well, I wanted to mention that this book follows the railroad. So, the railroad was a huge economic engine as it was pushing its way
Yeah.
from the Midwest to California. There was the wagon train, but the railroad. So, in this one, the train is going from Nogales towards California and it's going to skip the Tucson loop. So, it's going to shorten the train trip. And we're at Railhead 4, isn't that right? I think.
Yeah,
Um,
I was there. That route has never been. I mean, I looked believe me, I looked hard at railway maps of the time, and nobody ever built that route. And I don't understand why, because it would, it would have cut probably a day off the trip from California to the east. It was, it's the old from geometry, the one side of the triangle will always be shorter than the other two sides. And it would have been just tracing the border of Arizona straight to Nogales and into Southern California made all the sense in the world to me. But for some reason, they didn't think of it. I thought of it all these years
You
later.
did think of
Too
it.
late to make any money off of it, but
Well, yeah, but nonetheless, the flow of goods and people that, went along. I mean, there's a lot being written about the Santa Fe and, that railroad and the things that happened there. But I do think that after the Civil War, those 50 years, there was, or 40 years anyway, the railroads were really not only settled the West, but that's really where the money was. I say
yes,
that as a
absolutely.
Stanford graduate, right? Because,
Yeah.
Leland
Leland
Stanford, I
Stanford,
mean, the
yeah.
whole deal, he was the guy that hammered in the gold spike
Right.
somewhere up in like Ogden, Utah or whatever it was. And those guys were just like the Silicon Valley, money guys today. They were making Gould and all those guys, they were milking the railroads and setting themselves up as basically, railroad billionaires as opposed to tech
Indeed.
billionaires. They were a real oligarchy
Of course.
in the Gilded Age. Okay. So it's important to remember that. Could I also mention that Gunman Jackson Swagger has a great horse? I
Is
really do.
what
He has a great horse.
he does have a great horse. I think my daughter Amy, who was a great horsewoman when she was younger, and she really made sure that I didn't make too many mistakes. And I imbued the horse. I mean, that's a Western tradition, the genius horse. And I had fun. I never thought I would, but I had a great deal of fun giving him the making the horse as heroic as the man was.
Sorry, I'm going to fade away again because my voice is going again. Back over to you. But I wanted to get the railroad part in because I think it's important.
Well, yeah, I wanted to talk about Arizona, 1890s version. That whole period is I find so fascinating, and obviously you do too. The kind of the Geronimo ended the Apache Wars. That was 1886. You got the Ghost Dance, 1890, and then what's going on? It's like the modern era is creeping in,
Yes, it is.
and the
Yeah.
railroads, of course, signaled the end of the frontier era formally,
It
right?
is a fascinating era, although I was disappointed to learn that the Arizona Rangers didn't come along until the 20th century. I think their first year of operation was 1906 or something like that.
Really?
Uh,
Okay.
I may be wrong off a few years, but I had thought at one point I would work in an Arizona Ranger, but there were no Arizona Rangers to be worked in, so I had to leave them out. Maybe sometime in the future, I'll do an Arizona Ranger book if this one is successful.
Right. Well, talk a little bit about kind of conceiving this vast family saga. I mean, we've got Bob Lee, we have Earl, and then Jackson would be Earl's grandfather. Is that right?
He is Earl's grandfather and Bob's great grandfather.
Great grandfather.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, as I say, this was not something I planned on doing, but it sort of foisted itself on me. And when I decided to go back to the West, many people had said to me, "Why don't you write a Western? Because
Right.
there's Western elements in all the Bobley Swagger books." And it just seemed ridiculous to do a Western without Swagger at the center. And so I contrived a way to put the swagger at the center. And I sort of tried to build a family tree in such a way that it was Well, I mean, one of the issues is the distribution of the swaggers. They're basically in Arizona, but this guy, I'm sorry, in Arkansas, but this guy's in Arizona. How does he get to Arizona? Why did he go to Arizona? I had to come up with what I thought were meaningful reasons for that. But we have to keep a connection with Arkansas because he has to have a son who will have a son named Earl, who will have a son named Bob Lee. So I don't know if anybody is tracking this stuff except me. I tracked it as well as I could. Tracking stuff is not one of my strengths. So maybe I'm missing a generation, or maybe I've got one too many generations in there. I think people will understand that I tried my best in good faith. And it was just, God, it was just fun. Writing a book like this is fun. And I'm at an age now with enough work behind me that I'm not going to write a book unless it's fun. You know, I've, I'm just, I suffer from what might be called Glock fatigue, meaning I'm sick of not only Glocks, but the whole inventory of modern thrillers, of
Mm.
spy satellites and computers and cell phones. That stuff just bores me sick. And I wanted to go back to a whole different generation of technology, particularly guns. And if you know your firearms history, 1897 was a very interesting year because all sorts of things were happening in all sorts of areas. And I was able to sort of show them off, bring them into play in the course of the book. There's Mauser pistols and Maxim machine guns, and there's a particular kind of Colt that wasn't manufactured until 1894 called the Bisley. And if you ever saw it, it looks like a peacemaker only with a broken back. It's kind of humpbacked, and for some reason, I've always thought it was a damned interesting design, very attractive to my eye. So I decided to give Swagger Bisleys instead of peacemakers. But unfortunately, the gun didn't get its nickname Bisley until 1912. And that was because that's when the shooting contests at Bisley, England started. And it was a star of those. And that's where it got the nickname Bisley, even though it had first been manufactured in 1894. So I tried very hard. And I think I got it right. No one ever calls it a Bisley because obviously the word didn't exist in 1897. But if you know anything about Colts, you'll recognize it. Plus, I fought like hell to get them to include a picture of a Bisley on the title page. And so they can reference that if they're confused.
Now, are you a
That's me,
collect
always helping my readers.
are you a collector yourself of
I
fire?
have a few, yes. In fact, I have got two Bisleys.
Really?
I should have had one out to show you, but I neglected to do so. And they're supposedly the most accurate of the Colt Peacemaker variants. And a few famous gunmen carried them. Sam Bass carried, oh, no, 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 wait, I'm getting mixed up with another old gun that figures in another project I'm working on. So we'll forget Sam Bass. I will say that the Bisley was known as the gunfighter's gun because it for a lot of reasons it made more sense for a gunfighter than the traditional uh, uh, peacemaker, and I tried to, make that a factor
Was it
in the.
more reliable?
Yes, well, it was easier to handle. It was extremely accurate, more reliable. Yes, indeed. I mean, it's built as a target gun, the reason it had such a strange crook in the grip was because the way they shot target in those days was one-handed, and they raised the gun to the eye, And that grip made more sense. But make it a good target gun, you also make it a good gunfighter's gun. And I'll tell you who carried one historically. Uh, uh, I will tell you as soon as it comes back into my head, Pancho Villa. And
Is
there's a
that right?
picture of Pancho Villa with a Bisley in his stuck in his belt towards the end. So it's a gun with quite a bit of history to it.
Right. Well, the whole Pancho Villa, that excursion is fascinating on all these different levels. I mean, it was a little bit later, but was it
It was after the turn of the century, but yes, yeah, it was. He was a fascinating guy.
had a film crew that went along with him, and they, as I understand it, they staged the battles for the
That
film
wouldn't
crew.
surprise me.
Yeah, yeah. No, endlessly fascinating time.
Right. Wasn't on that when John Pershing kind of got his general,
Yes, yes, right. Well,
was fighting Pancho Villa, and then that he went off and led our troops in World War One when they were
that's
still
exactly
fighting
right.
with horses and
Yeah,
all the rest of it.
Out
Yeah.
of
I've often thought how interesting that was, how, it kind of that transition from Pancho Villa to World War One, which was really when war really began to change. Uh,
that's true. That's
and an
true.
Irish uprising in going on in Ireland the same year,
Yes, exactly.
it's true.
1916.
Yep.
Yeah. There's a great old hotel in Douglas, Arizona. I don't know if you've been there, Steve, where allegedly Pancho Villa rode his horse into the lobby and rode up the staircase, the central staircase. And it's still there. And Sandra and I stayed there one year, and it's definitely a haunted place.
Yeah, I remember taking my mom there.
Yeah.
We made a trip down to Tombstone and whatever, and then we went over to Douglas. And I remember when you go into the hotel, that's the centerpiece story that they tell you is
Yeah,
about Pancho Villa riding his horse up the stairs, right? I thought they only rode horses upstairs in movies by MGM or something, but apparently
yeah.
that actually happened. I mean, the Arizona border country really was fascinating. And in your book, that's part of what's going on is an exchange of goods of various
Yes,
sorts.
indeed. Yeah.
From the question is, why is this one property by Railhead 4 prosperous in this disastrous drought when everything else is a disaster? And that's one of the things that Jackson is there to figure out.
Well, that's one of the mysteries. I mean,
It is.
uh, a Western is a mystery story with six guns, just like a thriller is a mystery story with machine guns. That's basically, they've all got to have puzzles, and they've all got to have a kind of intellectual is the wrong word, but they've got to have a cognitive aspect of the plot in which things are found out and puzzles are assembled, and a result is manifest. And that's one of the pleasures of the genre, and one of the things that is fun to work on. I wish I were better at it. I mean, if you ask me, Steve, what's wrong with you? I would say, I wish I could come up with better plots. But this plot, I think, is pretty good.
I think it's a very good plot. And, one of the questions is what are the people's stakes? Who has a stake in what and how much does it matter? And I think you're very good at Jackson's being gradually revealed, because
Yes.
he does
Yeah.
have a stake as all. He's not just a drifter,
Yeah.
30 years after the Civil War who never really
Yeah.
got over it. Um, my favorite book of all your books remains The 47 Samurai.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
Well,
nice to
it's
see.
because I thought you were such a genius in figuring out how a gunman, Bob, could deal with a swordman, his Japanese opponent. And if you remember, I wrote to you when I was reading the arc on page 132, and I wrote to you and I said, I've got it. Yep. And it turned out I did. But I just loved that book. And you also had that war, because you started it out with Earl in the Pacific.
Yeah, Iwo Jima. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, that was uh, you know, multiple time frames there.
That was in my samurai movie period. However, I should say that there's a link there with this book. And the link is that this plot that I just mentioned not so much the plot, but the framing device, the structure of the book was stolen from a samurai movie. And my joke is people say, I hope people say, why did you write what why did you write a Western? And the answer would be, well, I finally found the right samurai movie to steal a plot from. And once I had that, I had everything. Not quite true, but nevertheless, there is a samurai overlay to this book.
Well, there is in Westerns the Kurosawa,
Of course, it's a
leading
tradition.
to the. Rob talks about that all the time because, the Kurosawa movie, the name of which I can't remember, is his Iwo Jima or whatever it is.
Yo,
Uh,
Jim.
yeah, right, is one of his favorite. He and Jack were talking, or David Morrell, because David was here over the weekend and they were talking movies and they were talking about the Kurosawa and the influence that that had.
Yes.
And
Well, he influenced a lot of modern storytelling, not only in the movies, but also in the way people thought about fiction and the focus on certain things that had never been looked at carefully before. And there is a lot, even now, there's a lot of if Jack Carr's John Reese is clearly a samurai figure, and that's he's a figure that's in most of our stories, even though in ways that probably would be different were it not for the influence of the samurai.
I'm sure you're right. So, Patrick, do we have questions from the audience?
Let's see. Yes. Hold on just a second. Um, well,
Mostly it's obscene ranting, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, okay. Um, Someone asked, do you know if John Wayne was a good marksman in real life?
He was a hunter. He was gun savvy. That is to say, he owned a number. He was a Weatherby. You have to know your guns. Weatherbys were uh, big through the 50s, 60s, 70s. They were guns that were built on Mauser actions by a guy named, I think his name was Reed Weatherby. Maybe I have the first name wrong. And they were chambered in calibers that were more powerful in each classification. In other words, you could buy a 243 Winchester or you could buy a 243 Weatherby. The 243 Weatherby would be faster than the 243 Winchester. And a lot of hunters, they look for velocity. And Wayne had a collection of Weatherbys. And as I say, he was a well-known sportsman, and he was gun savvy. And I think you can tell by watching him that he's comfortable with guns. He's not, there's no neurosis about the guns. One thing you don't know is I've seen it. The gun, he carried the same Peacemaker in just about all its westerns, and someone early in his career had hammered out the trigger guard. That is, they busted it out so that it was about twice as big. It looked terrible, but his hands were so big and meaty that he could manipulate it much better with the big with that trigger guard than he could with a an untouched Colt trigger guard. If you saw the gun, you would think, why did they ruin that beautiful revolver? And they ruined it to make it easier for Wayne to handle it. And they did the same thing with a Winchester. He had a 92 Winchester that he used in many of his movies, and because he had a real big hands, they hammered out the lever action on the Winchester so that it was a loop. And they later Chuck Chuck Connors used a similar gun in the TV show, The Rifleman, but that made it easier for him to handle it. And because he was so tall, he was one of the few men who could spin it under his arm to cock it. And that was a great move. I mean, particularly particularly if you're 8 years old. It's a great move. And let's put it this way. I don't think he was Audie Murphy quality shot, but he certainly was convincing on screen.
Let's see. Okay, do you have a favorite gun? Pistol, rifle?
Uh, I've always loved, and it appears in lots of books of mine where it has no business appearing. It's an iteration of the Thompson submachine gun called the M1A1, and that is the military Thompson that the paratroopers jumped into Normandy with. And it's got some differences from the gangster version of the Thompson. And for some reason, its lines are incredibly attractive to me. I just think I mean, a lot of this stuff has to do with your attraction to some designs, which feels arbitrary, and your uninterest in other designs. Again, arbitrary, but that gun's design feels it's just always attracted me. So I guess I would have to say that.
Do you have one?
Interesting question. I've actually got a collection of Thompson iconography. I've got photos, I've got toys, I've got dummy guns, I've got all kinds of Thompson, I guess you would call it Thompsonolia or they call it tobaccoania. It's is ashtrays. So it would be Thompsonania. That is a bunch of sort of artifacts of the Thompson. And between you and me, do I have an actual Thompson submachine gun M1A? And the answer is, of course I do. Come
Of course
on.
you do.
Or I have to. I'm Steve Hunter. I have to.
Absolutely. And then when you wrote your earlier book, G-Men, you were kind of immersed in that. The third,
That's my most Thompson rich book. But as I say, I've snuck it in all kinds of places.
um,
Let's
let's,
ask Barbara what her favorite gun is. Barbara, what's your favorite gun?
Um, I'm not a gun person. I often find it amusing that I seem to spend my life with guys who write thrillers with all kinds of weaponry. The only time I probably ever shot a gun was at CJ Box's ranch in Wyoming when he offered me a chance to fire his 45 and it nearly knocked me down. My dad was a skeet shooter and he
Uh-huh.
had a really beautiful shotgun that had
Those were beautiful guns. They
God, it
are
was.
beautiful
Yeah, it
guns.
had,
Yeah.
silver plates on the stock and they were
Yeah.
incised and all the rest of it. And he was a hunter too. Back in the 50s, it was a corporate perk to take executives to places. So he went to Alaska to fish and Alcoa had some kind of a gorgeous hunting reserve. And I think it was in the Carolinas for duck, if I
Uh-huh.
remember right. And he also went and shot pheasants in South Dakota. So
Yeah.
I remember that to prepare pheasants, we had to like dig out, all the
Yes.
mud or
Yes.
whatever
Yes.
it was, to ruin your teeth. But
I've done all that, so I know exactly what you're
I was
talking
brought
about.
up in suburbs and cities, and so guns didn't actually
Yeah.
enter my life until I became a bookseller.
There you go. There
Yeah,
you go.
right. Anything else, Patrick?
uh, I think that might be it.
All right. Well,
Wait,
Stephen, it's always what? One more.
one more. One more. Someone wants to know if if do you do outlines or are you, I hate to use these terms because they're so obnoxious, but
I
plot.
know they really are.
Do you, yeah,
Okay, the answer to that is occasionally. Occasionally, I do outlines. The project I'm working on now, which I am not yet at liberty to chat about, is exhaustively, almost to the chapter and page outlined. And in fact, it has big swatches of dialogue and scenes. And I had a great deal of fun doing that. However, the Jack book as I say, I had the framework, uh, but I didn't, I didn't have the book part of it. You know what I'm saying? I knew how to start it, I knew how to end it, but I had no idea how to fill 200 pages in between. And I just did it. And things kept popping up at exactly the right time and seemed to me to be exactly at the right tone or pitch or kind of reality, and it just sort of miraculously assembled itself before my astounded eyes. And that plot, it just came from the unconscious. It was a day-to-day thing. I mean, sometimes I sit down, I had no idea what to do, and just somehow my fingers do. If my brain didn't, my fingers had figured it out, and they just got busy. And when I read what they'd done, I said to myself, yeah, that works. So, as I say, it varies. Some books, it's very precise, and other books, it's a blind night grope through a dense fog, and there's no way of predicting which. And I can't tell you which one is better and which one is worse. I do think that the importance of the outline, there is an importance to the outline, and that is it gives you a structure. And without a structure, you're lost. Hemingway he wrote, an enormous amount every day for the last 10 years of his life. And he did it without an outline, and none of the stories had any structure at all. And in order to publish them, as eventually they were, someone had to go and sort of, you know, put assemble these big chunks of narrative into a beginning, a middle, and an end. Because they were just words. That's the difference between writing and putting down a lot of words. And theoretically, those of us who are lucky enough to be able to write for a living know a little bit about putting it all together in the proper order so that people can enjoy it.
Hmm.
And an unflagging pace, because that's true too. You don't want to have sagging spots in the pace and the narrative.
That's right.
Yeah, it works really well. All right. Well, thank you all very much for watching it. Stephen, it's always a joy to be with you. Patrick, thanks for filling in, so to speak,
Yeah,
or contributing to the whole thing.
absolutely.
Our book should be arriving as soon as we solve a shipping label problem. But honestly, we are just about sold out. So we'll sorry if you'll be disappointed, but I'm not going to challenge Stephen to sign a batch of books.
I'm
One,
not going to
one, one
sign
round is
anything.
enough.
I signed so many, and then that's it.
Yes, you did. You
It
were great.
reads just as well without a signature, doesn't it?
All right.
Yeah.
Well, it does. That's absolutely true. But nonetheless, we're really grateful to Stephen, who has been to see us, and we've done some events, but he's been wonderful about
If I
signing
could
books
still
for us.
travel and I can't, I would be out there.
Well, we'll see how that works
Maybe
out. In
next
the
year.
meantime, we do have this technology that allows us to get together, so I'm really grateful for it. So thanks everybody for watching. Good night.
Thank you all, and bye bye now.